From an old print. Never yet had any European wintered in these regions, in the midst of that slothful and immovable sea, which, according to the very false expressions used by Tacitus, forms the girdle of the world, and in which is heard the uproar caused by the rising of the sun. The Dutchmen, therefore, were unable to picture to themselves the sufferings which threatened them. They bore them, however, with admirable patience, without a single murmur, and without the least want of discipline or attempt at mutiny. The conduct of these brave seamen, quite ignorant of what so apparently dark a future might have in reserve for them, but who with wonderful faith had placed their affairs in the hands of God, may be always proposed as an example even to the sailors of the present day. It may well be said that they had really in their heart the as triplex of which Horace speaks. It was owing to the skill, knowledge, and foresight of their leader Barents, as much as to their own spirit of obedience, that the Dutch sailors ever came forth from Nova Zembla, which threatened to be their tomb, and again saw the shores of their own country. Interior view of the house. Interior view of the house. From an old print. The bears, which were extremely numerous at that period of the year, made frequent visits to the crew. More than one was killed, but the Dutchmen contented themselves with skinning them for the sake of their fur, and did not eat them, probably because they believed the flesh to be unwholesome. It would have been, however, a considerable addition to their food, and would have saved them from using their salted meat, and thus they might longer have escaped the attacks of scurvy. But that we may not anticipate, let us continue to follow the journal of Gerrit de Vere. On the 23rd September, the carpenter died, and was interred the next day in the cleft of a mountain, it being impossible to put a spade into the ground, on account of the severity of the frost. The following days were devoted to the transport of driftwood and the building of the house. To cover it in, it was necessary to demolish the fore and aft cabins of the ship. The roof was put on the 2nd October, and a piece of frozen snow was set up like a maypole. On the 31st September, there was a strong wind from the northwest, and as far as the eye could reach, the sea was entirely open and without ice. But we remained as though taken and arrested in the ice, and the ship was raised full 2 or 3 feet upon the ice, and we could imagine nothing else but that the water must be frozen quite to the bottom, although it was 3 fathoms and a half in depth. On the 12th October, they began to sleep in the house, although it was not completed. On the 21st, the greater part of the provisions, furniture, and everything which might be wanted was withdrawn from the ship, for they felt certain that the sun was about to disappear. A chimney was fixed in the center of the roof, inside a Dutch clock was hung up, bedplaces were formed along the walls, and a wine cask was converted into a bath, for the surgeon had wisely prescribed to the men frequent bathing as a preservative of health. The quantity of snow which fell during this winter was really marvelous. The house disappeared entirely beneath this thick covering, which, however, sensibly raised the temperature within. Every time that they wished to go forth, the Dutchmen were obliged to hollow out a long corridor beneath the snow. Each night they first heard the bears, and then the foxes, which walked upon the top of the dwelling, and tried to tear off some planks from the roof, that they might get into the house. So the sailors were accustomed to climb into the chimney, whence, as from a watchtower, they could shoot the animals and drive them off. They had manufactured a great number of snares, into which fell numbers of blue foxes, the valuable fur of which served as a protection against cold, while their flesh enabled the sailors to economize their provisions. Always cheerful and good-tempered, they bore equally well the ennui of the long polar night, and the severity of the cold, which was so extreme that during 2 of 3 days, when they had not been able to keep so large a fire as usual, on account of the smoke being driven back again by the wind, it froze so hard in the house that the walls and the floor were covered with ice to the depth of 2 fingers, even in the cots where these poor people were sleeping. It was necessary to thaw the sherry when it was served out, as was done every 2 days at the rate of half a pint. On the 7th of December, the rough weather continued, with a violent storm coming from the northeast, which produced horrible cold. We knew no means of guarding ourselves against it, and while we were consulting together what we could do for the best, one of our men in this extreme necessity proposed to make use of the coal which we had brought from the ship into our house, and to make a fire of it, because it burns with great heat and lasts a long time. In the evening we lighted a large fire of this coal, which threw out a great heat, but we did not provide against what might happen, for as the heat revived us completely, we tried to retain it for a long time. To this end, we thought it well to stop up all the doors and the chimney, to keep in the delightful warmth. And thus each went to repose in his cot, and animated by the acquired warmth, we discoursed long together. But in the end, we were seized with a giddiness in the head, some, however, more than others. This was first perceived to be the case with one of our men who was ill, and who for this reason had less power of resistance. And we also ourselves were sensible of a great pain which attacked us, so that several of the bravest came out of their cots, and began by unstopping the chimney, and afterwards opening the door. But the man who opened the door fainted, and fell senseless upon the snow, on perceiving which, I ran to him and found him lying on the ground in a fainting fit. I went in haste to seek for some vinegar, and with it I rubbed his face until he recovered from his swoon. Afterwards, when we were somewhat restored, the captain gave to each a little wine, in order to comfort our hearts. On the 11th, the weather continued fine, but so extremely cold, that no one who had not felt it could imagine it. Even our shoes, frozen to our feet, were as hard as horn, and inside they were covered with ice in such a manner that we could no longer use them. The garments which we wore were quite white with frost and ice. On Christmas Day, the 25th December, the weather was as rough as on the preceding days. The foxes made havoc upon the house, which one of the sailors declared to be a bad omen, and upon being asked why he said so, answered, "Because we cannot put them in a pot or on the spit, which would have been a good omen." If the year 1596 had closed with excessive cold, the commencement of 1597 was not more agreeable. Most violent storms of snow and hard frost prevented the Dutchmen from leaving the house. They celebrated Twelfth Night with gaiety, as is related in the simple and touching narrative of Gerrit de Vere. For this purpose, we besought the captain to allow us a little diversion in the midst of our sufferings, and to let us use a part of the wine which was destined to be served out to us every other day. Having 2 pounds of flour, we made some pancakes with oil, and each one brought a white biscuit, which we soaked in the wine and eat. And it seemed to us that we were in our own country, and amongst our relations and friends, and we were as much diverted as if a banquet had been given in our honor, so much did we relish our entertainment. We also made a 12th Night king, by means of paper, and our master gunner was king of Nova Zembla, which is a country enclosed between 2 seas, and of the great length of 600 miles. After the 21st January, the foxes became less numerous, the bears reappeared, and daylight began to increase, which enabled the Dutchmen, who had been so long confined to the house, to go out a little. On the 24th, one of the sailors, who had been long ill, died, and was buried in the snow at some distance from the house. On the 28th, the weather being very fine, the men all went out, walking about, running for exercise and playing at bowls, to take off the stiffness of their limbs, for they were extremely weak and nearly all suffering from scurvy. They were so much enfeebled that they were obliged to go to work several times before they could carry to their house the wood which was needful. At length, in the first days of March, after several tempests and driving snowstorms, they were able to verify the fact that there was no ice in the sea. Nevertheless, the weather was still rough and the cold glacial. It was not feasible as yet to put to sea again, the rather because the ship was still embedded in the ice. On the 15th of April, the sailors paid a visit to her and found her in fairly good condition. Exterior view of the house. Exterior view of the house. From an old print. At the beginning of May, the men became somewhat impatient, and asked Barentz if he were not soon intending to make the necessary preparations for departure. But Barentz answered that he must wait until the end of the month, and then, if it should be impossible to set the ship free, he would take measures to prepare the longboats and the launch, and to render them fit for a sea voyage. On the 20th of the month, the preparations for departure commenced. With what joy and ardor it is easy to imagine. The launch was repaired, the sails were mended, and both boats were dragged to the sea, and provisions put on board. Then, seeing that the water was free, and that a strong wind was blowing, Heemskirk went to seek Barentz, who had been long ill, and declared to him that it seemed good to him to set out from thence, and in God's name to commence the voyage and abandon Nova Zembla. William Barentz had before this written a paper setting forth how we had started from Holland to go towards the kingdom of China, and all that had happened, in order that, if by chance someone should come after us, it might be known what had befallen us. This note he enclosed in the case of a musket, which he hung up in the chimney. On the 13th June, 1597, the Dutchmen abandoned the ship, which had not stirred from her icy prison, and commending themselves to the protection of God, the two open boats put to sea. They reached the Orange Islands, and again descended the western coast of Nova Zembla in the midst of ceaselessly recurring dangers. On the 20th of June, Nicholas Andrew became very weak, and we saw clearly that he would soon expire. The lieutenant of the governor came on board our launch, and told us that Nicholas Andrew was very much indisposed, and that it was very evident that his days would soon end. Upon which William Barentz said, "It appears to me that my life also will be very short." We did not imagine that Barentz was so ill, for we were chatting together, and William Barentz was looking at the little chart which I had made of our voyage, and we had various discourses together. Finally, he laid down the chart and said to me, "Gerard, give me something to drink." After he had drunk, such weakness supervened that his eyes turned in his head, and he died so suddenly that we had not time to call the captain, who was in the other boat. This death of William Barentz saddened us greatly, seeing that he was our principal leader and our sole pilot, in whom we had placed our whole trust. But we could not oppose the will of God, and this thought quieted us a little. Thus died the illustrious Barentz, like his successors Franklin and Hall, in the midst of his discoveries. In the measured and sober words of the short funeral oration of Gerrit de Vere may be perceived the affection, sympathy, and confidence which this brave sailor had been able to inspire in his unfortunate companions. Barentz is one of the glories of Holland, so prolific in brave and skillful navigators. We shall mention presently what has been done to honor his memory. Map of Nova Zembla. After having been forced several times to haul the boats out of the water when they were on the point of being crushed between the blocks of ice, after having seen on various occasions the sea open and again close before them, after having suffered both from thirst and hunger, the Dutchmen reached Cape Nassau. One day, being obliged to draw up the longboat, which was in danger of being stove in upon an iceberg, the sailors lost a part of their provisions and were all deluged with water, for the ice broke away under their feet. In the midst of so much misery, they sometimes met with good windfalls. Thus, when they were upon the ice on the island of Crosses, they found there 70 eggs of the mountain duck, but they did not know what they should put them in to carry them. At length one man took off his breeches, tying them together by the ends, and having put the eggs into them, they carried them on a pike between two, while the third man carried the musket. The eggs were very welcome, and we eat them like lords. From the 19th July, the Dutchmen sailed over a sea which, if not altogether free from ice, was at least clear of those great fields of ice which had given them so much trouble to avoid. On the 28th July, when entering the Gulf of St. Lawrence, they met with 2 Russian vessels, which at first they dared not approach. But when they saw the sailors come to them unarmed and with friendly demonstrations, they put aside all fear, the rather as they recognized in the Russians some people whom they had met with the year before in the neighborhood of Waigatz. The Dutchmen received some assistance from them and then continued their voyage, still keeping along the coast of Nova Zembla and as close inshore as the ice would allow. Upon one occasion when they landed, they discovered the Cochlearia scurvigrass, a plant of which the leaves and seeds form one of the most powerful of known antiscorbutics. They eat them, therefore, by handfuls and immediately experienced great relief. Their provisions were, however, nearly exhausted. They had only a little bread remaining and scarcely any meat. They decided, therefore, to take to the open sea in order to shorten the distance which separated them from the coast of Russia, where they hoped to fall in with some fishermen's boats, from which they might obtain assistance. In this hope they were not deceived, although they had still many trials to undergo. The Russians were much touched by their misfortunes, and consented on several occasions to bestow provisions upon them, which prevented the Dutch sailors from dying of hunger. In consequence of a thick fog, the 2 boats were separated from each other, and did not come together again until some distance beyond Cape Cannon on the further side of the White Sea, at Kildin Island, where some fishermen informed the Dutchmen that at Kola there were 3 ships belonging to their nation, which were ready to put to sea on their return to their own country. They therefore dispatched thither one of their men accompanied by a Laplander, who returned 3 days afterwards with a letter signed Jan Rape. Great was the astonishment of the Dutch at the sight of this signature. It was only on comparing the letter just received with several others which Heemskerk had in his possession that they were convinced that it really came from the captain who had accompanied them the preceding year. Some days later, on the 30th September, Rape himself arrived with a boat laden with provisions to seek them out and take them to the Kola River, in which his ship was at anchor. Rape was greatly astonished at all that they related to him, and at the terrible voyage of nearly 1,200 miles which they had made, and which had not taken less than 104 days, namely, from the 13th June to the 25th September. Some days of repose, accompanied by wholesome and abundant food, sufficed to clear off the last remains of scurvy and to refresh the sailors after their fatigues. On the 17th September, Jan Rape left the Kola River, and on the 1st November the Dutch crew arrived at Amsterdam. "We had on," says Gerrit de Veer, "the same garments which we wore in Nova Zembla, having on our heads caps of white fox skin, and we repaired to the house of Peter Hasselaer, who had been one of the guardians of the town of Amsterdam, charged with presiding over the fitting out of the 2 ships of Jan Rape and of our own captain. Arrived at this house, in the midst of general astonishment, because that we had been long thought to be dead, and this report had been spread throughout the town, the news of our arrival reached the palace of the prince, where there were then at table the chancellor, and the ambassador of the high and mighty king of Denmark and Norway, of the Goths and the Vandals. We were then brought before them by M. Elecautets and 2 lords of the town, and we gave to the said Lord Ambassador and to their lordships, the burgomasters, a narrative of our voyage. Afterwards each of us retired to his own house. Those who had not dwellings in the town were lodged in an inn until such time as we had received our money, when each went his own way. These are the names of the men who returned from this voyage: Jacob Heemskerk, clerk and captain; Peter Peterson Voss, Gerrit de Veer, mate; Jan Voss, surgeon; Jacob Jansen Sterenberg, Leonard Henry, Lawrence William, Jan Hillebrandts, Jacob Jansen Huchwout, Peter Cornet, Jacob de Buysen, and Jacob Averts. Of all these brave sailors we have nothing further to record, except that de Veer published the following year the narrative of his voyage, and that Heemskerk, after having made several cruises to India, received in 1607 the command of a fleet of 26 vessels, at the head of which, on the 25th of April, he had a severe battle with the Spaniards under the guns of Gibraltar, in which battle, although the Dutch were the conquerors, Heemskerk lost his life. The spot where the unfortunate Barentz and his companions had wintered was not revisited nearly 300 years after their time. The first to double the northern point of Nova Zembla, Barentz had remained alone in the achievement until this period. On the 7th September, 1871, the Norwegian captain, Elling Carlsen, well known by his numerous voyages in the North Sea and the Frozen Ocean, arrived at the ice haven of Barentz, and on the 9th he discovered the house which had sheltered the Dutchmen. It was in such a wonderful state of preservation that it seemed to have been built but a day, and everything was found in the same position as at the departure of the shipwrecked crew. Bears, foxes, and other creatures inhabiting these inhospitable regions had alone visited the spot. Around the house were standing some large puncheons, and there were heaps of seal, bear, and walrus bones. Inside, everything was in its place. It was the faithful reproduction of the curious engraving of Gerrit de Veer. The bed places were arranged along the partition as they are shown in the drawing, as well as the clock, the muskets, and the halberd. Amongst the household utensils, the arms, and the various objects brought away by Captain Carlsen, we may mention 2 copper cooking pans, some goblets, gun barrels, augers, and chisels, a pair of boots, 19 cartridge cases, of which some were still filled with powder, the clock, a flute, some locks and padlocks, 26 pewter candlesticks, some fragments of engravings, and 3 books in Dutch, one of which, the last edition of Mendoza's History of China, shows the goal which Barentz sought in this expedition, and a manual of navigation proves the care taken by the pilot to keep himself well up in all professional matters. Upon his return to the port of Hammerfest, Captain Carlson met with a Dutchman, Mr. Lister Kay, who purchased the Barent's relics and forwarded them to the authorities of the Netherlands. These objects have been placed in the Naval Museum at The Hague, where a house, open in front, has been constructed precisely similar to the one represented in the drawing of Gerrit de Veer, and each object or instrument brought back has been placed in the very position which it occupied in the house in Nova Zembla. Surrounded by all the respect and affection which they merit, these precious witnesses of a maritime event so important as the first wintering in the Arctic regions, these touching reminiscences of Barents, Heemskirk, and their rough companions, constitute one of the most interesting monuments in the museum. Beside the clock is placed a copper dial, through the middle of which a meridian is drawn. This curious dial, invented by Plancius, which served without doubt to determine the variations of the compass, is now the only example extant of a nautical instrument which has never been in very general use. For this reason it is as precious as, from another point of view, are the flute used by Barents and the shoes of the poor sailor who died during the winter sojourn. It is impossible to behold this curious collection without experiencing poignant emotion. Chapter 4. Voyages of Adventure and Privateering Warfare. Drake Cavendish de Noort, Walter Raleigh. A very poor cottage at Tavistock in Devonshire was the birthplace in 1540 of Francis Drake, who was destined to gain millions by his indomitable courage, which, however, he lost with as much facility as he had obtained them. Edmund Drake, his father, was one of those clergy who devote themselves to the education of the people. His poverty was only equaled by the respect which was felt for his character. Burdened with a family as he was, the father of Francis Drake found himself obliged from necessity to allow his son to embrace the maritime profession, for which he had an ardent longing, and to serve as cabin boy on board a coasting vessel which traded with Holland. Industrious, active, self-reliant, and saving, the young Francis Drake had soon acquired all the theoretical knowledge needed for the direction of a vessel. When he had realized a small sum, which was increased by the sale of a vessel bequeathed to him by his first master, he made more extended voyages. He visited the Bay of Biscay and the Gulf of Guinea, and laid out all his capital in purchasing a cargo which he hoped to sell in the West Indies, but no sooner had he arrived at Rio de la Hacha than both ship and cargo were confiscated, we know not under what frivolous pretext. All the remonstrances of Drake, who thus saw himself ruined, were useless. He vowed to avenge himself for such a piece of injustice, and he kept his word. In 1567, 2 years after this adventure, a small fleet of 6 vessels, of which the largest was of 700 tons burden, left Plymouth with the sanction of the Queen to make an expedition to the coasts of Mexico. Drake was in command of a ship of 50 tons. At first starting, they captured some Negroes on the Cape de Verde Islands, a sort of rehearsal of what was destined to take place in Mexico. Then they besieged La Mina, where some more Negroes were taken, which they sold at the Antilles. Hawkins, doubtless by the advice of Drake, captured the town of Rio de la Hacha, after which he reached St. Jean d'Aloa, having encountered a fearful storm. But the harbor contained a numerous fleet, and was defended by formidable artillery. The English fleet was defeated, and Drake had much difficulty in regaining the English coast in January 1568. Drake afterwards made 2 expeditions to the West Indies for the purpose of studying the country. When he considered himself to have acquired the necessary information, he fitted out 2 vessels at his own expense: the Swan, of 25 tons, commanded by his brother John, and the Pasha of Plymouth, of 70 tons. The 2 vessels had as crew 73 Jactars, who could be thoroughly depended on. From July 1572 to August 1573, sometimes alone, sometimes in concert with a certain Captain Ross, Drake made a lucrative cruise upon the coasts of the Gulf of Darien, attacked the towns of Vera Cruz and of Nombre de Dios, and obtained considerable spoil. Unfortunately, these enterprises were not carried out without much cruelty and many acts of violence, which would make men of the present day blush. But we will not dwell upon the scenes of piracy and barbarity which are only too frequently met with in the 16th century. After assisting in the suppression of the rebellion in Ireland, Drake, whose name was beginning to be well known, was presented to Queen Elizabeth. he laid before her his project of going to ravage the western coasts of South America by passing through the Strait of Magellan, and he obtained, with the title of admiral, a fleet of 6 vessels, on board of which were 160 picked sailors. Francis Drake started from Plymouth on the 15th November, 1577. He had some intercourse with the Moors of Mogador, of which he had no reason to boast, made some captures of small importance before arriving at the Cape de Verde Islands, where he took in fresh provisions, and then was 56 days in crossing the Atlantic and reaching the coast of Brazil, which he followed as far as the estuary of La Plata, where he laid in a supply of water. He afterwards arrived at Seal Bay in Patagonia, where he traded with the natives and killed a great number of penguins and sea wolves for the nourishment of his crew. Some of the Patagonians who were seen on the 13th May a little below Seal Bay, says the original narrative, wore on the head a kind of horn, and nearly all had many beautiful birds' feathers by way of hats. They also had the face painted and diversified by several kinds of colors, and they each held a bow in the hand, from which every time they drew it, they discharged 2 arrows. They were very agile, and as far as we could see, well instructed in the art of making war, for they kept good order in marching and advancing, and for so few men as they were, they made themselves appear a large number. M. Charton, in his Voyageurs Anciens et Modernes, notices that Drake does not mention the extraordinary stature which Magellan had attributed to the Patagonians. For this, there is more than one good reason. There exists in Patagonia more than one tribe, and the description here given by Drake of the savages whom he met does not at all resemble that given by Pigafetta of the Patagonians of Port St. Julian. If there exist, as seems now to be proved, a race of men of great stature, their habitat appears fixed upon the shores of the strait at the southern extremity of Patagonia, and not at 15 days' sail from Port Desire, at which Drake arrived on the 2nd June. On the following day, he reached the harbor of St. Julian, where he found a gibbet erected of yore by Magellan for the punishment of some rebellious members of his crew. Drake, in his turn, chose this spot to rid himself of one of his captains, named Doughty, who had been long accused of treason and underhand dealing, and who on several occasions had separated himself from the fleet. Some sailors having confessed that he had solicited them to join with him in frustrating the voyage, Doughty was convicted of the crimes of rebellion and of tampering with the sailors, and according to the laws of England, he was condemned by a court-martial to be beheaded. This sentence was immediately executed, although Doughty, until the last moment, vehemently declared his innocence. Was his guilt thoroughly proved? If Drake were accused upon his return to England, in spite of the moderation which he always evinced towards his men, of having taken advantage of the opportunity to get rid of a rival whom he dreaded, it is difficult to conceive that the 40 judges who pronounced the sentence should have concerted together to further the secret designs of their admiral and condemn an innocent man. On the 20th of August, the fleet, now reduced to 3 vessels, 2 of the ships having been so much damaged that they were at once destroyed by the admiral, entered the strait, which had not been traversed since the time of Magellan. Although he met with fine harbors, Drake found that it was difficult to anchor in them, on account both of the depth of the water close to the shore and of the violence of the wind, which, blowing as it did in sudden squalls, rendered navigation dangerous. During a storm which was encountered at the point where the strait opens into the Pacific, Drake beheld one of his ships founder, while his last companion was separated from him a few days afterwards, nor did he see her again until the end of the campaign. Driven by the currents to the south of the strait as far as 55 degrees 40, Drake had now only his own vessel, but by the injury which he did to the Spaniards, he showed what ravages he would have committed if he had had still under his command the fleet with which he left England. During a descent upon the island of Mocha, the English had 2 men killed and several wounded, while Drake himself, hit by 2 arrows on the head, found himself utterly unable to punish the Indians for their perfidy. In the harbor of Valparaiso, he captured a vessel richly laden with the wines of Chile and with ingots of gold valued at 37,000 ducats. Afterwards, he pillaged the town, which had been precipitately abandoned by its inhabitants. At Coquimbo, the people were forewarned of his approach, so that he found there a strong force, which obliged him to re-embark. At Arica, he plundered 3 small vessels, in one of which he found 57 bars of silver valued at 2,006 L. In the harbor of Lima, where were moored 12 ships or barks, the booty was considerable. But what most rejoiced the heart of Drake was to learn that a galleon named the Cagafugo, very richly laden, was sailing towards Perica. He immediately went in pursuit, capturing on the way a bark carrying 80 pounds of gold, which would be worth 14,080 French crowns, and in the latitude of San Francisco he seized without any difficulty the Cagafugo, in which he found pounds weight of gold. This caused the Spanish pilot to say, laughing, "Captain, our ship ought no longer to be called Cagafugo Spitfire, but rather Cagaplata Spit Money. It is yours which should be named Cagafuego." After making some other captures more or less valuable upon the Peruvian coast, Drake, learning that a considerable fleet was being prepared to oppose him, thought it time to return to England. For this, there were 3 different routes open to him. He might again pass the Strait of Magellan, or he might cross the Southern Sea, and doubling the Cape of Good Hope might so return to the Atlantic Ocean, or he could sail up the coast of China and return by the Frozen Sea and the North Cape. It was this last alternative, as being the safest of the 3, which was adopted by Drake. He therefore put out to sea, reached the 38 degrees of north latitude, and landed on the shore of the Bay of San Francisco, which had been discovered 3 years previously by Bodega. It was now the month of June, the temperature was very low, and the ground covered with snow. The details given by Drake of his reception by the natives are curious enough. When we arrived, the savages manifested great admiration at the sight of us, and thinking that we were gods, they received us with great humanity and reverence. As long as we remained, they continued to come and visit us, sometimes bringing us beautiful plumes made of feathers of divers colors, and sometimes petan, tobacco, which is a herb in general use among the Indians. But before presenting these things to us, they stopped at a little distance, in a spot where we had pitched our tents. Then they made a long discourse after the manner of a harangue, and when they had finished, they laid aside their bows and arrows in that place, and approached us to offer their presents. The first time they came, their women remained in the same place, and scratched and tore the skin and flesh of their cheeks, lamenting themselves in a wonderful manner, whereat we were much astonished. But we have since learnt that it was a kind of sacrifice which they offered to us. The facts given by Drake with regard to the Indians of California are almost the only ones which he furnishes upon the manners and customs of the nations which he visited. We would draw the reader's attention here to that custom of long harangues which the traveler especially remarks, just as Cartier had observed upon it 40 years earlier, and which is so noticeable amongst the Canadian Indians at the present day. Drake did not advance farther north and gave up his project of returning by the Frozen Sea. When he again set sail, it was to descend towards the line, to reach the Moluccas, and to return to England by the Cape of Good Hope. As this part of the voyage deals with countries already known, and as the observations made by Drake are neither numerous nor novel, our narrative here shall be brief. On the 13th of October, 1579, Drake arrived in latitude 8 degrees north, at a group of islands of which the inhabitants had their ears much lengthened by the weight of the ornaments suspended to them. Their nails were allowed to grow, and appeared to serve as defensive weapons, while their teeth, black as ship's pitch, contracted this color from the use of the betel nut. After resting for a time, Drake passed by the Philippines, and on the 14th of November arrived at Ternate. The king of this island came alongside, with 4 canoes bearing his principal officers dressed in their state costumes. After an interchange of civilities and presents, the English received some rice, sugar canes, fowls, figo, cloves, and sago. On the morrow, some of the sailors who had landed were present at a council. When the king arrived, a rich umbrella or parasol all embroidered in gold was borne before him. He was dressed after the fashion of his country, but with extreme magnificence, for he was enveloped from the shoulders with a long cloak of cloth of gold reaching to the ground. He wore as an ornament upon the head a kind of turban made of the same stuff, all worked in fine gold and enriched with jewels and tufts. On his neck there hung a fine gold chain many times doubled and formed of broad links. On his fingers he had 6 rings of very valuable stones, and his feet were encased in shoes of Morocco leather. After remaining some time in the country to refresh his crew, Drake again put to sea, but his ship on the 9th of January, 1580, struck on a rock, and to float her off, it was necessary to throw overboard 8 pieces of ordnance and a large quantity of provisions. A month later, Drake arrived at Barretna Island, where he repaired his ship. This island afforded much silver, gold, copper, sulfur, spices, lemons, cucumbers, coconuts, and other delicious fruits. We loaded our vessels abundantly with these, being able to certify that since our departure from England, we have not visited any place where we have found more comforts in the way of food and fresh provisions than in this island and that of Ternate. After quitting this richly endowed island, Drake landed at Greater Java, where he was very warmly welcomed by the 5 kings amongst whom the island was partitioned, and by the inhabitants. These people are of a fine degree of corpulence. They are great connoisseurs in arms, with which they are well provided, such as swords, daggers, and bucklers, and all these arms are made with much art. Drake had been some little time at Java when he learnt that not far distant there was a powerful fleet at anchor, which he suspected must belong to Spain. To avoid it, he put to sea in all haste. He doubled the Cape of Good Hope during the first days of June, and after stopping at Sierra Leone to take in water, he entered Plymouth Harbor on the 3rd November, 1580, after an absence of 3 years all but a few days. The reception which awaited him in England was at first extremely cold, his having fallen by surprise both upon Spanish towns and ships, at a time when the 2 nations were at peace, rightly caused him to be regarded by a portion of society as a pirate who tramples under foot the rights of nations. For 5 months the Queen herself, under the pressure of diplomatic proprieties, pretended to be ignorant of his return. But at the end of that time, either because circumstances had altered, or because she did not wish to show herself any longer severe towards the skillful sailor, she repaired to Diptford where Drake's ship was moored, went on board, and conferred the honor of knighthood upon the navigator. Elizabeth knighting Drake. Elizabeth knighting Drake. From this period, Drake's part as a discoverer is ended, and his afterlife as a warrior and as the implacable enemy of the Spaniards does not concern us. Loaded with honors and invested with important commands, Drake died at sea on the 28th January, 1596, during an expedition against the Spaniards. To him pertains the honor of having been the second to pass through the Strait of Magellan and to have visited Tierra del Fuego as far as the parts about Cape Horn. He also ascended the coast of North America to a point higher than any his predecessors had attained, and he discovered several islands and archipelagos. Being a very clever navigator, he made the transit through the Strait of Magellan with great rapidity. If there are but very few discoveries due to him, this is probably either because he neglected to record them in his journal, or because he often mentions them in so inaccurate a manner that it is scarcely possible to recognize the places. It was he who inaugurated that privateering warfare by which the English, and later on the Dutch, were destined to inflict much injury upon the Spaniards, and the large profits accruing to him from it encouraged his contemporaries and gave birth in their minds to the love for long and hazardous voyages. Among all those who took example by Drake, the most illustrious was undoubtedly Thomas Cavendish, or Candish. Cavendish joined the English marine service at a very early age and passed a most stormy youth, during which he rapidly dissipated his modest fortune. That which play had robbed him of, he resolved to recover from the Spaniards. Having in 1585 obtained letters of marque, he made a cruise to the East Indies and returned with considerable booty. Encouraged by his easy success as a highwayman on the great maritime roads, he thought that if he could acquire some honor and glory while engaged in making his fortune, so much the better would it be for him. With this idea he bought 3 ships, the Desire of 20 tons, the Content of 60 tons, and the Hugh Gallant of 40 tons, upon which he embarked 123 soldiers and sailors. Setting sail on the 22nd July, 1586, he passed by the Canaries and landed at Sierra Leone, which town he attacked and plundered. Then, sailing again, he crossed the Atlantic, sighted Cape Sebastian in Brazil, sailed along the coast of Patagonia, and arrived on the 27th November at Port Desire. He found there an immense quantity of dogfish, very large, and so strong that 4 men could with difficulty kill them, and numbers of birds, which, having no wings, could not fly, and which fed upon fish. They are classed under the general names of auks and penguins. In this very secure harbor, the ships were drawn up on shore to be repaired. During his stay at this place, Cavendish had some skirmishes with the Patagonians, men of gigantic size, and having feet 18 inches long, who wounded 2 of the sailors with arrows tipped with sharpened flints. On the 7th January, 1587, Cavendish entered the Strait of Magellan, and in the narrowest part of it received on board his ships 21 Spaniards and 2 women, the sole survivors of the colony founded 3 years previously, under the name of Philippeville by Captain Sarmiento. This town, which had been built to bar the passage through the strait, had possessed no fewer than 4 forts as well as several churches. Cavendish could discern the fortress, then deserted and already falling into ruins. Its inhabitants, who had been completely prevented by the continual attacks of the savages from gathering in their harvests, had died of hunger, or had perished in endeavoring to reach the Spanish settlements in Chile. The admiral, upon hearing this lamentable tale, changed the name of Philippeville into that of Port Famine, under which appellation the place is known at the present day. On the 21st, the ships entered a beautiful bay, which received the name of Elizabeth, and in which was buried the carpenter of the Hugh Gallant. Not far from thence, a fine river fell into the sea, on the banks of which dwelt the anthropophagi who had fought so fiercely with the Spaniards, and who endeavored, but in vain, to entice the Englishmen into the interior of the country. On the 24th February, as the little squadron came forth from the strait, it encountered a violent storm which dispersed it. The Hugh Gallant, left alone, and letting in water in all directions, was only kept afloat with the greatest trouble. Rejoined on the 15th by his consorts, Cavendish tried in vain to land on Mocha Island, where Drake had been so maltreated by the Araucanians. This country, rich in gold and silver, had hitherto successfully resisted all Spanish attempts to subjugate it, and its inhabitants, fully determined to maintain their liberty, repulsed by force of arms every attempt to land. It was necessary, therefore, to go to the island of St. Maria, where the Indians, who took the Englishmen for Spaniards, furnished them with abundance of maize, fowls, sweet potatoes, pigs, and other provisions. On the 30th March, Cavendish dropped anchor in 32° 50 in the Bay of Quintero. A party of 30 musketeers advanced into the country and met with oxen, cows, wild horses, hares, and partridges in abundance. The little troop was attacked by the Spaniards, and Cavendish was obliged to return to his ships after losing 12 of his men. He afterwards ravaged, plundered, or burnt the towns of Perica, Cincha, Pisca, and Paita, and devastated the island of Puna, where he obtained a booty in coined money of the value of 25,760 L. After having scuttled the Hugh Gallant, which was totally unfit any longer to keep the water, Cavendish continued his profitable cruising, burnt, in the latitude of New Spain, a ship of 120 tons, plundered and burnt Aguachilio, and captured, after 6 hours of fighting, a vessel of 708 tons, laden with rich stuffs, and with 122,000 gold pesos. Then, victorious and contented, Cavendish wished to secure the great spoils which he was conveying against any chance of danger. He touched at the Ladrones, the Philippines, and Greater Java, doubled the Cape of Good Hope, recruited himself at St. Helena, and on the 9th September, 1588, anchored at Plymouth, after 2 years of sailing, privateering, and fighting. At the end of 2 years after his return, of all the great fortune which he had brought back with him, there remained only a sum sufficient for the fitting out of a third, and as it proved, a last expedition.